Hey guys. So, the ontological argument, it makes a powerful and rational case for the existence of God. And it was developed by St. Anselm as he discussed with God how to convince the fool that doesn't believe in God that God actually exists. So, when you think about it, it's really quite amazing that this argument that's so rational, one of those rational and logically taxing arguments for God's existence, was born out of a time of personal worship. That just kind of is really interesting to me. But as Anselm prayed, he made this statement in chapter 2 of his book, Prosologium. Therefore, if that, than which nothing greater can be conceived, exists in the understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater can be conceived. But obviously this is impossible. Hence, there is no doubt that there exists a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in the understanding and in reality. Now, what this means, as simply put as possible, as best I can say it, is that since we understand, in theory, that God is the greatest possible being, if he only existed in theory in our minds, if we can only mentally understand that God exists, that anything that actually exists is greater than God. Therefore, God must exist in more than theory, because nothing can be greater than God. And so, for instance, as we think about through what this implies, is saying, basically, if all we can think of is that God is the greatest possible being, but God doesn't actually exist, then we ourselves are greater than God because we actually exist. And so what this argument is saying is that to exist is better than to not exist, which I think is a pretty rational statement, rational belief. So basically, if all we can do is think about God as being the greatest possible being, then God's not the greatest possible being because all we can do is think about him as being the greatest possible being. So therefore, he must actually exist as the greatest possible being. Now, that can be really confusing. And sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense at all. For example, just because I think of something, I conceive of something, to use Anselm's language, it doesn't mean it exists, right? For instance, if we use one of the guys named Gamillo, his illustration of an island, like just because the perfect island can possibly exist, like I can imagine and think about, there's an island that is perfect, has the best sand and everything like that, then I can mentally comprehend it. Just doesn't mean that it exists. That doesn't make that island automatically exist. However, that problem with this ontological argument, this limitation of it, can be resolved by some reasoning concerning what a necessary being is. For instance, God, by his very nature, as the greatest possible being to exist, as this perfect being, by his very nature, he necessarily exists. And so, because if God did not exist, then we would not have the world to live in, right? Like, if God did not exist, then we would have nothing. We would have no concept of God because God does not exist. Therefore, the argument for the ontological, for the existence of a perfect island fails where it succeeds for God, since God is necessary, it is necessary for God to exist. A perfect island doesn't have to. But another limitation of the argument is that, man, it requires a lot of deep thinking that not everyone is willing or even capable of giving. And further, since it is a purely rational argument, it doesn't delve at all into any kind of empirical evidence. And so that can kind of throw some people off. They're like, well, that's way too deep and difficult to think about, or, well, that's not how I feel about it. It's not, I don't experience that. It's just a very logical and rational way of thinking about it. But personally, I really like the ontological argument. I think it did take me some time to really grasp the concept. I had to read it slowly, but when I understood it, I really liked it. I think Anselm's reasoning is beautiful and powerful. I think that also the argument is really valuable because of its pure rationality. I would really probably use this mostly in academic circles, in which reason is the highest authority. And while I can't really see myself using it often, if I was discussing the existence of God with someone who thought very rationally, I would offer it as an argument. I would be worried about talking with people over their heads, since it does require an intense level of thinking. But overall, I think that the idea that if we can conceive of God as the greatest possible being, but he doesn't actually exist and God's not that great. And so I think Anselm's argument really works.